Hi, y'all. I'm Bragg. I'm the managing editor of The Margin. We're a nonprofit outlet that centers people um, bearing the brunt of environmental injustice in the United States. It's like a little ironic. I'm streaming from New Orleans and there's like a storm overhead. And living in a place where water is always a topic of frustration, confusion. We're below sea level. A random flash flood can make traffic bad or put lives at risk. It's a particularly interesting moment to be talking about that with this really great panel of people. We're going to talk about Texas flooding from prevention, flood control, resilience, recovery. We had the privilege of publishing a piece at the margin about a sort of retrospective on maybe a once in a lifetime kind of program in Harris County, Texas, which is home to Houston, in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and just helping people that were in floodplains that were deemed hopelessly deep. The government had to step in and relocate people. And obviously, leaving home, whether it's forced or a choice, is always a tense matter. And it's something that more and more people are forced to reckon with presently, even in places that historically were not marked as at risk. As we'll get to in our discussion, there are increasing bureaucratic government decisions that are also killing people. As seen in Texas. We have Amal Ahmed, who's a freelance writer from Houston, currently based in Southwest Washington. She's the author of After Allen Field, which was recently named a finalist for explanatory journalism at the Nonprofit News Awards. She previously covered the environment and climate change from Texas. Her work has been published at a variety of outlets, from the Texas Tribune, Grist, and The Margin, of course. We also have Alice Liu, who was featured in the piece. Alice is a Houston-based organizer and writer working in disaster recovery and climate justice. She's the co-director of communications and organizing at West Street Recovery, a grassroots organization formed during Hurricane Harvey that is using the disaster recovery process to build people power on the front lines of climate crisis. And last but never least, we have Zoe Middleton, who is the Associate Policy Director for Just Climate Resilience for Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In her role, she shapes policy, research, and strategy agendas to drive the adoption of science-based, equitable policies at the local, state, and federal levels. And I think I want to start it back with the piece that we were just talking about, Amal, that actually brought us all together. The piece was a retro on, like I said, perhaps I don't know, I want to hear your opinion on that, of if something like this can ever happen again, managed retreat in Harris County in the wake of Hurricane Harvey.
Happy to talk about it. I do have to say I'm from Dallas, so I feel like I have to correct the record. Just my Dallas pride showing through. No, but just a lot of climate stuff happens in Houston, so I feel like I've spent so much time there too, of course. The piece that was published in the margin is actually a follow-up story to some reporting I had done a couple years earlier about Allen Field, right? So in my first reporting project from Allen Field, I was really focusing on the experience of people as they were going through this program, right? These hard questions about like, what does it mean to leave a place that people have lived in for generations, right? Where all their memories going back to like their great grandparents, right, are from this place, and this feeling that infrastructure could have been built and there were choices that were made not to prioritize neighborhoods like this, right? And now people are being told there's nothing we can do for you except move you out of this neighborhood. So that story, again, really focused on what was happening in the moment. And I wanted to revisit people after they'd moved and kind of talk about what was the experience like, once you're in a safer place. It was a little pleasantly surprising, right, that a lot of folks I talked to were actually in a much better place, right? I think a lot of the reporting that I do in the climate justice sphere, that's not always the case. It's often like very, difficult, like recoveries take a very long time. But Dolores, who's one of the main people that I talked to from Allen Field, right? Like her whole family was able to move to neighborhoods that didn't flood, right? In 2024 when there were storms that came through Houston. Better schools for the kids. Like, it ends up that her family is kind of all close together still, which is a major concern when they were going through the program. And then in Greens Road, which is a mobile home community where people were also bought out and relocated, you had folks who were able to purchase permanent structures, not be living in mobile homes for the first time in their lives, right? Or maybe even go from renting to owning a home, right? So there were some pretty interesting trajectories, right? That I think the first story didn't necessarily capture, but once the dust had settled, that's kind of what had happened. But obviously, it was still a very uphill battle, for everyone involved. Like people really had to advocate for themselves. There's a lot of grassroots organizing, right? Showing up in commissioner's court, putting yourself in vulnerable positions to talk about things like your status as undocumented immigrants, right? And asking, why aren't we getting a fair deal just because of our citizenship status, right? If this is a mandatory buyout. So there were a lot of issues, that people actually fought for and won, which I think was interesting. But the other kind of key question that I had was like, if the county had learned anything from this program, right? Like a mandatory program that offers people more money than a voluntary program, right? That ended up getting people to safer ground. Like, what does that even mean in the Trump administration, right? Where questions about equity and resilience and all of that are really being de-emphasized and defunded, right? So this story kind of talks through kind of those trends, which at the time I was writing this, it really felt like everything was up in the air, right? I think I remember going back and forth with Zoe and Alice, like as things were happening, like policy changes, just like, what does this mean? There's still a lot of, I think, research that's really needed to understand from a sociological perspective, right? Like really the impact of programs like this on communities. And I think that piece is still something that folks, in the academic world or even the nonprofit world are definitely working on, but it's really interesting to kind of think about how little we really know about the outcomes of programs like this too.
I remember editing this piece, and there's been some other similar pieces that we've done with the margin with all of the shakeups with the Trump administration, where you put something in, and then like an hour later, you're like, actually, I have to delete that whole thing, or I have to adjust it because it doesn't exist anymore, or that funding is gone. I'm curious, Alice, Zoe, if you can talk a little bit about where Houston is now with this program, other budgeting opportunities for housing, flood control, buyouts. What's the climate?
So there's two entities to consider. There's the city of Houston, which has ordinance making power, and its own like structurally imbalanced budget. And then there's Harris County, which ran the buyout program that Amal wrote about. And neither of them are in a particularly good financial situation. And a lot of the instability at the federal level, whether it's cancellations of grant programs, rolling back awards, puts adaptation and honestly just basic city services and management, like the bottom line, that especially for City of Houston, like further at risk.
The whole apparatus code that you're referring to of disaster preparedness, disaster recovery, bio programs, it really happens in very much a piecemeal way. But in terms of the city of Houston, from the perspective of Western Recovery, which is an organization that directly just physically rebuilds homes that have been damaged by disaster and that have been neglected by both government and larger nonprofit programs, we've been somewhat critical of these mandatory bio programs and voluntary bio programs because of the lack of similar resources that our government has put into helping people rebuild who do want to stay. And just as a point of comparison, West Recovery started as a totally volunteer-led organization in 2017. And at one point, a couple of years after Hurricane Harvey, we had repaired a comparable number of houses to the entire city of Houston's home repair program. So I think that's just an example of the almost unbelievable lack of resources that have been put into repairing homes. And then on the side of flood mitigation infrastructure, as Zoe is saying, the first half of this year, the city of Houston was really emphasizing that it was in a fiscal crisis, and it was using that as a reason to underfund drainage infrastructure by over $100 million. And this was an acute situation this year, but it is a pattern that we have seen over decades where one by one, these pots of money that are allocated for flood infrastructure or in the case of the city of Houston's budget this year was legally mandated to go towards flood infrastructure are sort of siphoned away to go to other political priorities like police in the case of city of Houston. And what that has left the city in overall is a position of chronically underfunded infrastructure, of failing infrastructure, both in terms of flood mitigation infrastructure and drinking and sewer infrastructure. And we are absolutely feeling the pain of that, not just every hurricane season, but throughout the year as well with every heavy rain.
Alice, I think you mentioned like drainage infrastructure is huge, right? For people that are not from Houston or have never really been there, I think it's really important to kind of visualize what this means, right? Like there are neighborhoods where the drainage system is literally just a ditch that's been dug, right? And there's some big kind of drains, but that's it, right? They're not like kind of more modern or more like capable of really taking away all this floodwater. So it's like really night and day in some neighborhoods. If you, if you go to a place like Allen Field and then you go somewhere downtown, right? Like it's just completely different.
I think that's a great point. In Houston, because of how rapidly we've developed as a city, a lot of areas outside of downtown, in terms of the drainage infrastructure there, it's just the original infrastructure that the developers chose. And so, for example, in a lot of neighborhoods in Northeast Houston, as Amal was saying, that is just an open ditch. A lot of those neighborhoods were much more rural. And now, as there's been more concrete, more things paved over, these open ditches that you usually see like on the sides of fields and farmland are now being used as the main infrastructure in what is now a very urban area with high flood risk. And some neighborhoods that we work in, there's not even ditches. It's just the street itself is supposed to be the drainage infrastructure there.
On the housing side, with City of Houston, before I get to the county, I'll just say like most of the city's housing budget comes via HUD, which has had massive budget slashing and reductions. So the city relies on federal funds to run its housing programs, to fund its development, and that's going away. At the same time, right now, it's a live issue. The city of Houston has received an allocation to support disaster recovery, specifically money going through HUD after the barrel and the derecho. And originally there was $0 allocated to housing recovery, despite that being the single largest documented recovery need. We are now at the point where we've gotten up to a commitment for $50 million, and there might be $100 million. But that was an issue that had to be forced because there were simply other investment priorities, as Alice mentioned, other political priorities that were determining the future of adaptation, of resilience. And I think that really gets to the point that like resilience has become something by a series of political choices that has been completely individualized. The government at various levels have absolved themselves of political responsibility. And just as we're starting to see a larger political recognition of the need for resilience, those programs like BRIC, which is now under temporary injunction, which is the FEMA program, are being walked back and put at further jeopardy. And you need pretty much every funding source you can get because addressing long-standing neglect is costly. Which brings me to the issue of the Harris County budget. So at the county lacks ordinance making ability, which means it basically just can't pass laws, but it can make policies that set forward like how it decides to spend its own money. It also has fewer sources of revenue than the city. So the city collects sales tax and all these other things. The county can only collect property tax, and because of a state law, it can never raise property tax more than 3.5%. There's also currently in this special session, which I know is very contested, we might not have time to get into today, but in the special session, there's a proposal to further restrict the ability of counties to raise property tax beyond 2.5%. And I'll say like the county has been more ambitious around social policy and climate adaptation than the city has been, in part because they were in the financial position at the time they were ambitious to be so, but it's a really, really big deal, these proposed constraints. And so the county was also in a structurally like unsound position. They had a deficit that was projected to be about 160 million, but because of again political priorities and decisions, i.e. law enforcement raises, the proposed deficit has increased by $147 million. And now they're going to be really deep cuts on top of federal cuts. So, I mean, people talk about like a climate doom loop or a downward spiral, and they're usually talking about physical impacts, right? But there's also real like fiscal management, fiscal decision making, political decision making that feeds into and worsens the climate doom loop at federal, state, and local levels.
It's a really important point, and I do hope we have time to talk a little bit about the hearings that are ongoing. I want to talk a little bit about FEMA too right now. I think we're talking about just like those different funding sources, and obviously FEMA is a big one. And what happened in Hill Country in Texas was, as we're seeing with more investigative reports come out, was like epic failure, and that's not even like an appropriate summation. With the like requirement that Nome, the head of DHS has to sign off on any expense over 100K. Then there are the stories coming out about how the contracts ended for people who were supposed to pick up the phone to help people who are calling that need help getting that emergency money, finding things, people, because they didn't renew that contract. And so there were search and rescue teams that didn't go out for 72 hours, thousands of calls from survivors of these floods that killed 138 people, I believe, in a flash flood, on a holiday weekend or a holiday moment. And this is because people are not doing paperwork, or they've created these like this red tape that there's already enough red tape, I think, in dealing with FEMA. I think anybody who's gone through any type of storm or disaster would agree with that. Can we talk about a little bit where we are now? Because even with, Harvey was a terrible response, obviously, and we're in a worse place.
Prior to this version of the Trump administration, the Trump regime, like FEMA was not had been given a really, really big and growing mandate. It kind of grown and grown and grown upon itself, was asked to do a lot. It was never appropriately funded, never appropriately staffed. And there were probably some internal organizational culture things that held them back from making the kind of progress that the current moment, increasingly severe weather demands. So it like totally needed reform. I don't disagree with that. And we're in a situation where like this lust for power has thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and it's made everyone less safe in some of the worst possible moments of their life. No one should have to pick up limbs from their property on their own after surviving a massive flood. But if there's no search and rescue and you know your neighbors are missing, what are you supposed to do? And that's on budget cuts. It's on budget cuts, it's on mass firings, that's it. And so this idea that you can gain more control over a system by making it quote unquote more efficient, more effective, like we need to see who's on the other end of that, right? Who suffers the most because of those rollbacks. And right now it's people that are experiencing some of the worst moments of their lives. And this is all about like, a consolidation of power. And I'll also say like, yesterday I think it came out that there's been an order to transfer FEMA staff who are on paid leave, people who are not able to respond to disasters currently for whatever reason that DOSHA decided, and transfer them to ICE to vet enforcement officer and enforcement agent applications. And that is a total abdication of responsibility. There are 86 days left in hurricane season. They're hanging everyone in a flood area, prone area out to dry. They're hanging everyone in a wildfire area out to dry.
So in Allen Field, Dolores and her family, they said to me, like, nobody ever comes out to rescue us. Nobody ever comes out to see if we're fine. Like we do that ourselves. We know who to call in our family, our network, or folks. There's no street lights here, so the baseline was already that, right? So what you're seeing now is like maybe we wouldn't have expected it to get this bad, but like I think it's really important to remember there are pockets of every county, every city, right, where the baseline has just been way below zero, right? So yeah, it's really devastating, and I think just when you're coming from something that's already so low, like it's kind of crazy to see just how bad it can get, I think.
Individual households are not the only survivors that FEMA is supposed to help. There is also assistance to local governments. And we've seen the Trump administration be incredibly, first of all, delay assistance to local governments and then deny it and be really capricious in the denials. It's really picking favorites, right? Seemed pretty politically motivated. And that has really, really big implications, especially now when we are in local budget season, like in the Hill Country. There's not a huge, tax base, not a huge tax revenue source, right? Especially for counties where you can only collect property taxes. And in the hearing that I went to the other week, all of the local elected officials were like, we don't want to raise taxes on people that have just gone through a disaster, that like are trying to figure out where they're going to sleep in 6 months' time. But like, unless the state guarantees that it's going to help us, unless, the federal government says, actually, we'll do 100% cost share, like we're in a complete state of financial limbo, and that could easily lead to bankruptcy. And it just really important to emphasize that like local fiscal distress is always a cover, almost always used as a cover for consolidation and privatization, which just reduces further accountability and response capacity.
As we've said, we know it's not about efficiency, right? Like ultimately, this is underfunding FEMA is going to cost the government hundreds of millions of more than just properly funding FEMA in the first place. And we know it's also not about an overall belief in small government, because we have no problem giving ICE billions of dollars, um, giving billions of dollars to weapons manufacturers. And ultimately, we need to think about the whole that the absence of FEMA is going to create in the disaster response economy, right? What private interests does this now fall upon, both in terms of the response itself, in terms of having to rebuild back the infrastructure? We've seen in cities across the US, after moments of crisis with water infrastructure, that is exactly when private companies like Jacobs swoop in and offer contracts to essentially save the city from itself. Who is also to benefit when people can't rebuild their homes and people are forced to move and be displaced from these communities that they've been in, as Amal said, for generations. And it's the same sort of private interests, the same private equity firms that prey on these neighborhoods that have just been broken up by disaster after disaster.
That's so important. I think as the cost of flood insurance is like at a place where it's unreachable for many people and also like increasingly falling on individuals. And I think what Amal gets to in the piece and like is that like buyouts, not a perfect system whatsoever, are like a big picture way of reducing overall risk. And like, what does it look like to collectivize these costs and invest in infrastructure? And like also in the meantime, there's the reality that like if something floods right now, I'm maybe not prepared because historically I haven't had to be. I want to talk a little bit about the like privatizing response and recovery aspect and like what is shifting to the individual and what needs to be collectivized if we have like any chance at getting this right.
I'm going to answer your question in a little bit of a different way, and then maybe Zoe and Alice want to jump in. So I've been sort of thinking about like what would a buyout look like in a place like Hill Country, right? I think something that's really important to remember is that Allen Field was a mandatory buyout, right? So the government actually had more responsibility to the people that it was relocating, right? They actually had a larger cost. They were supposed to actually make people whole, right? When a voluntary program, there's like it's a percentage of what you would get in the mandatory program, right? Because the rules and kind of rights of eminent domain don't kick in. I think there's been a lot of talk about how people are living in these really dangerous areas of the floodplain. To relocate them, like people are going to get like $10,000-$20,000, right? And that's it. And it's like in an economy like this, where do you go with that kind of money, right? Like you were actually going to have to make up the rest of that money. And so Harris County's reasoning behind the mandatory buyout was exactly that, was that if we really want people to move out of these places that we've deemed like hopelessly deep in the floodplain, we have to actually fund them to get to a new house, not just part of, not just like something that wouldn't even be a down payment, right, in most areas. So I think that's really important to remember. I would just add that, like, in terms of like resources, kind of looking at insurance rates and things, I know Texas Appleseed just put out a really cool database or dashboard that tracks some of this. So if anyone's like interested in looking into that, I think that's a really interesting resource that's available as well.
In terms of what risks and costs have been individualized, I would say almost all of it has been individualized. And that's the sort of baseline that people who have lived in Texas, like myself, for my whole life, like I constantly have to remind myself that the government like actually has a role to play. And some examples of that in terms of like individual costs that people take on to prepare themselves and their households for disasters. It's become increasingly common for people to spend thousands of dollars on a generator or just like a completely sort of off-grid home power system, because the electricity grid, which is run by a private company, is just completely undependable and was knocked out for weeks after a Category 1 storm last year. Anything from food to water, just yearly hundreds of dollars of costs that are spent on individual and household level preparedness. And then, of course, in terms of the actual impacts of a flood, we work with a lot of folks who, after Hurricane Harvey, had to spend essentially their entire life savings to fill in the gaps of what they weren't able to receive from government or other nonprofit aid programs. And then even at the level of infrastructure, until just 3 years ago, we were able to change this policy through Western Recovery and the Northeast Action Collective's advocacy. But until just a few years ago, for 2 decades, the city of Houston had explicitly pawned off responsibility of keeping drainage ditches clean and maintained onto individual residents as well.
There's also like all of these financing mechanisms that are supposed to help you recover that people have to bear an extraordinary financial burden. So you have rising home insurance costs. The Texas State Department of Insurance, which is a appointed body of commissioners that oversee and regulate insurance in the state, hasn't denied a rate increase since 2017, and the rates are steadily climbing. And then you see like in the case of flood insurance, there's flood insurance, which is necessary as like a publicly backed insurance product because floods are incredibly costly to recover from. They're incredibly common, and there's no market incentive for insurers to provide flood insurance because of the risk that it proposes. And the National Flood Insurance Program does not have any affordability provisions. And so people are on now what's called a glide path of rate increases. And they say, don't worry, your rates will only increase up to 10% a year. I don't know about you, but like a 10% increase on flood insurance on top of unregulated increases in home insurance, on top of other rising housing costs, um, energy volatility, those out-of-pocket costs of keeping, an extra backed up pantry, all those other things, lost wages, lost days at work, really add up. And so I think there are these financial tools and mechanisms that we also have to consider as the unseen costs of individualizing risk.
I think in the immediate aftermath of the storm, people were like really getting excited that all these HEB trucks were rolling in. And I think that's just another example of how folks forget that like it's not the role of corporations to do that. That's actually PR for them in a lot of ways. Not saying that it's not well intentioned, but I think it's just something to question. I think in these times, right, like our reliance on like corporate things like that instead of like government social safety nets.
I know that came up a little bit in what you wrote this week, Zoe, and what you really point out in your post for the Union of Concerned Scientists was that it's like about the political performance that followed these disasters and like the money that is supposed to be that can move a lot faster. Like for example, as you mentioned, Texas state law gives Governor Abbott in coordination with the Legislative Budget Board, the authority to transfer state funds following declared emergencies like these floods, without the need for a special legislative session or a special committee. And that despite an increase of like extreme weather events like the derecho, hurricanes, et cetera, Texas's surplus, which is a $23.8 billion surplus, like rainy day fund, has no dedicated disaster reserve fund. And the governor has not used that money for responses to the winter storm that really stressed the power grid, to say the least, or Hurricane Harvey. And like, can you just talk a little bit about what we're missing with that and like what's happening now compared to like what actually could be happening much more swiftly?
I think in general, like adaptation is about political will, right? And we've kicked the can down the road a really long time, and we've gotten to a point where the geography of risk and the frequency of disasters and the financial impact of disasters, much like the runaway housing crisis, right, and the unaffordability crisis, is impossible to ignore. And so instead of transferring funds to stabilize Texas counties that are potentially at risk of bankruptcy or certainly financial stress following hill country floods, instead of fairly and appropriately allocating mitigation funds after Harvey to Harris County and City of Houston and areas on the Golden Triangle that were more exposed and choosing to reallocate them to wealthier, wider, more inland areas. We have a state government in particular that chooses to use what is an unignorable issue, a very emotional issue, a very personal issue for many people, to further consolidate its power and advance its agenda. Um, and they're doing this in a very short-sighted way because of the risks to the eighth largest economy in the world, even if you don't care about people, which they clearly don't, right? Um, the inability of our capacity to bond, all of these things are really being thrown to the wind. And you have to ask who they're being thrown to the wind for, especially when you live in the oil and gas capital of the world. And like, again, what private entities and what private interests are taking precedence. But right now, like I mean, it's kind of clear it's a little opaque, but I think that the really important thing to note is that there is action that could be taken. I think people say like, well, no one's ever done enough on climate. We need to study this, we need to study that. There are some things that need to be studied, there are some things that need to be quantified. But when it comes to simply transferring money to stabilize individuals and to stabilize cities, that's an open and shut case. We can talk about when, where, how to build green or gray infrastructure in a really deep and considered way. And that's important to do. But when you're talking about keeping people out of debt, keeping cities out of debt, and saving lives, like it's not that complicated.
I know we've discussed too, like what can be done with sustained public anger. I think there's a lot of anger, frustration, devastation, grief happening following a lot of climate disasters. This one in particular, we've seen a lot of like really horrifying stories. I know you were at the hearings, right? So I just want to talk a little bit about that, and also for everyone to kind of chime in about like what is possible, because I think that the amount of government inaction, there's not enough that can be said about that. And also what do we do in the meantime collectively with the frustration that we're entitled to?
At the same time that these issues, which are very, very salient, are being used to consolidate power and to privatize and to cut people off from what their money could be doing for them, because that's mostly what the surplus is. It is important to also know that they are dynamic and lively issues, and that the door is not shut. There is room for negotiation and movement, and that requires forcing the issue frequently. Power is pretty inert, right? And so I think that that's really just important to there wouldn't be a massive housing bill on the Senate floor if things weren't up for discussion, if there weren't strange alignments and realignments of power. And at the same time, we have to refuse the notion that any of these concessions that we're getting at this point in time, at a moment of rising authoritarianism, are sufficient. And so I think, what we have to do now is to really prepare ourselves for an incredible amount of interference, a growing amount of interference, a growing amount of criminalization of people that are asking for more after disaster, asking for better. Ted Cruz just proposed RICO charges to be added to the National Riot Act for protests. Um, and that's a law that's designed to combat organized crime. It's not designed to combat organized communities after disasters. But that's a real potent risk. He's in the state with one of the highest levels of disaster nationwide. He understands the frustration and the dissatisfaction, and that's what he's choosing to do with it. So I think we need to prepare for extraordinary criminalization, pushback, censorship, misinformation. And while you prepare, you also have to plant the seeds for what you want next. And I think there's tremendous opening for a real ecological brand of populism that keeps the people and places that we love that are at greatest risk safe. But and prioritizes investment. But in an environment where everyone is concerned about cost, getting to that point, getting to that North Star is going to take a lot of presence, which I think has made a lot of what we've done in I would say in the last few months, but really in the last 8 years possible.
In the story, we talked about how folks from Greens Road had to mobilize and show up in court, and they eventually won an extra, I think, $7 million, right, from the county to fund their buyouts. So, I mean, I think that just speaks to the power of when you show up organized, right, and you're not just trying to fight the system by yourself, that's what you can win. I think it's interesting to see at the kind of national level, there's been a lot of anger at some of these rallies, right, around budget cuts and agencies being defunded. And we're sort of seeing the pendulum keep going back and forth, oh, okay, we'll rehire some of the staff at NW, National Weather Service who were fired, right? But I would say this piece actually, the questions around Greens Road and what it took for migrant communities to make those wins for themselves, that actually inspired another piece of reporting about, as deportations and ICE raids are increasing, and as ICE is getting a ton of money to do all this, right, it is having the intended effect, right, that it is harder for community organizers to get folks in immigrant communities now to show up to public meetings. And I think that's it's really concerning, and I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to counter that work, but I think it just shows how important it is to to figure out how to like keep each other safe, right? To do this kind of organizing safely, but also to do it in kind of solidarity and not increase anyone's vulnerability, I guess. Yeah.
There are like unlikely sources of support for all of that kind of progress. Like the $7 million increase to folks at Greens Road, that was unanimous. Like the most conservative man on the court, I was a staffer at the time, was like, yeah, well, yeah, we can't do this to these people. Like we have to give them this money. And I was like, I was not expecting it to be a unanimous vote. And you see like bipartisan defense of BRIC, and even like in the Hill Country hearings, there was a county judge who's a Republican who described, his county as fairly conservative and noted that they had voted for a conservation easement bond by 66%, to buy back land and protect it from development and reduce the risk of lives lost to flooding. So I just would say like people understand that they understand that there's smart science-backed solutions to it. And it's up to us to make like good decision making inevitable.
I think what Zoe has been doing an amazing job sort of leading is like localizing this national anger. And what I always think about is translating the sort of national mobilization that we've seen to these anti-Trump rallies, anger at the Doge at the federal level, and doing that education to really help people connect all of the ways that local governments are either not resisting enough, or in the case of the city of Houston and Harris County, further amplifying and adding on to those federal cuts. Um, I think like making that connection, translating that mobilization, that mass mobilization into more targeted and strategic actions, even just at the level of advocacy. I think we've seen that translate to, $100 million win in the case of this federal disaster recovery money. And the second point, I think, is that the increase in repression that we're seeing, branding climate organizations, Palestine organizations, migrant support organizations as terrorists, all of this is being uh, done because I think we're at a point in history where the more invisible forms of authoritarianism are translating into explicit violence and explicit repression. And they wouldn't be doing that unless they could sense the mass amounts of anger and this desire to resist, even if I think the efforts haven't been targeted and focused enough at a broad level. And so number three, I think like the specific opportunity that disasters provide is making these invisible systems and forces that are shaping people's lives visible. And that is the moment where if you have local organizations, uh, local political bodies that are positioned in a way to help people make that connection explicit, that's when the anger can be translated into a sort of real and viable political force. And I think that's our responsibility, especially as folks living on the front lines of the climate crisis. And hopefully, like my goal is for Houston to be a model nationally for how we can transform these really shitty situations into like real examples of community power building.
That's really well put and something I can relate to, living in New Orleans. Speaking of New Orleans, I think we have like I feel like, and maybe this is true in other places too, but resilient, when we use the word resilience here, people get a bit frustrated, because New Orleans is always being credited for how resilient it is. You guys are so strong. You go through so much. Like, and obviously this year is the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And so that is being talked about a lot. And I say that to say, like, there's the juxtaposition of resistance versus resilience to me. One is about preparation, and the other relies on this assumption that if you're constantly being resilient, you're being bent out of shape, you have to find ways to rebound, recover, rehome again and again. And it's not something that all demographics experience equally. I'm sure they are not calling the neighborhoods surrounding Tulane resilient. They're not facing the same type of recovery. And so what's the balance that we have to strike now and in the future? What does that look like, as I think someone said earlier, as governments absolve themselves and resilience is individualized?
When this is all like this particular authoritarian moment is all over, like we have to be pretty clear that what preceded it was already insufficient, like I said, and that like even though there might be some progress that's being made, like at the end of this, most of the people who are already most vulnerable are still going to be the most exposed to climate risk, to death, to displacement from the climate crisis, and they're going to be at even greater risk. Um, and so I think it's having that North Star because there is a real risk, especially as you see like these abundance narratives have broad appeal and a kernel of truth, but are really used to advance selective, like market-based policy making. Like that will extend to infrastructure, flood infrastructure. How could it not? And so I think we really need to carry a North Star with us about cost and affordability and like the primacy of class and the people who are frankly like most likely to die and most likely to disappear because of this crisis and like the ways of life that are most likely to disappear. And when this is over, to like, keep them at the center of our decision making and try to keep it at the center now, knowing that there are incredible odds and barriers to financing, solutions for those communities. But I think that that's keeping that North Star because by the time this is over, the geography of risk will just be massive.
I think, lately when folks bring up the word resilience, I was listening to an interview, I think, or reading an article, I can't remember, but, just with people who are surviving what's happening in Gaza right now, just like, how do you survive that? Like, how do you stay resilient? I think it's just like the most human instinct, right, to survive against all odds. But I think it's important for us, for those of us who are not in the center of that, to remember how much of this is man-made, like how much of the suffering is entirely preventable, obviously in terms of a war and a genocide, but also in terms of climate change. Like so much of this is just totally preventable, right? And I think that's like what we have to keep working towards. It's like when we know what the solutions are, when we know there's money and it's just not going to where it needs to go, right? And we know that there are problems and we know that there's inequities. Like I think it really falls to, the folks that are able to fight for that to keep doing that because that's what we owe the people at the center of it.
I think politicizing and denaturalizing all catastrophes, like I feel so mad at all of the publications who are willing to say the word famine, but not the word genocide and survival until revolution always. And we need to do both.
I think the will to transform is like the most human and beautiful and possible thing, and we just have to keep going.
Thanks for tackling that. I have a question from an anonymous attendee. Based on the new flood maps for Harris County, hundreds of thousands more people will be directly within a floodway. With the political environment where it is, are there any reasonable steps we bureaucrats can take to ensure people are protected and prepared for the next disaster?
Hello, bureaucrat. I would say a few things. There's a really big emphasis right now on risk communication, right? And certainly when budgets are low, right, you're like, I'm going to put out a flyer, I'm going to tell people about their risk, which is a form of individualizing and a form of, reshaping it. And so I think it's to be really like critical and like use how and when you're made, like you're put in the position of only doing risk communication to do it in a way that is empowering and like critical at the same time. It's an art, not a science. Um, I think there's stuff you do, like you can do internally in your meetings, about the problematization of relying on, like having fewer resources, and that kind of thing. And then I do think that, it's one of those things as the geography of risk grows, as more and more people, are at risk. Who do we know that we have to keep safe? It's really complicated to build flood protection projects, and flood resilience projects. And who are we asking to take on these extraordinary adaptation measures like mandatory buyouts, like voluntary buyouts, right? There are these really big changes in kind of household social order, like community social order. Who are we asking to adapt and how? I think is a really big question. And then I think, honestly, the most generous and possibly transformative thing you can do as an administrator, if you're a program administrator, is to just believe people. I think there's a lot of, when you're in a situation where you don't have enough resources, there's, confusing amount of political buy-in to do work, and or you feel like you have to shop around, your solutions for longer than it would take, you would like. I think not assuming, I mean, we say this all the time in like gender-based violence, right? Like belief survivors. It's the same thing with flooding. Like people know their experience is the best. They know how to make their own adaptation better. If they're, compensated and given the resources and the support to do it. that when it comes to program design, I think that like designing before implementation instead of, having to go back to the drawing board and do a bunch of forensic accounting to figure out what's the right amount of money that we need to put on the table to make people whole. And then getting support for doing that is really like honestly like a powerful and like sacred thing that a bureaucrat can do. It's just to believe people.
Common theme in like most of my reporting just on climate change ever, right, is that people are just blindsided when programs like, even in Allen Field, people were like, what is this program? Who decided this was what we needed, right? I think that's really common, right? And I think as a journalist, like I've heard that over and over again, like, oh, you're the first person that's asked us like what we actually think about this, right? It's really unfortunate that that happens, and so yeah, just to reiterate.
Also, in a political environment that can maybe make much more imaginative and ambitious ways of flood protection harder to accomplish. I think specifically in the context of Harris County and the city of Houston, pretty low-hanging fruit would just be improving like disaster preparedness and response communications. Just thinking about the fact that we don't have sirens. A lot of folks who are like signed up for the city registry to receive texts before a disaster don't get texts. And so the disaster communications is really bad. And I think like short of broader infrastructure improvements, that's something that could save a lot of lives and help people take care of themselves in the meantime.
I think we've talked a little bit about the rural preparedness versus metropolitan preparedness, and just, I think as you put it, Zoe, was the universal unbearableness of the access to recovery. And I really appreciate y'all talking through these issues at this moment in particular. Really grateful to Amal for writing the piece after Allen Field. I think those retrospective pieces are really important so that we don't forget all the work that went into something like this, especially in uncertain moments when it comes to flooding and what's going on in our political climate. I want to know if anybody has any closing thoughts before we sign off. Anything to leave our audience with? Actions, gratitude? I don't know.
Definitely gratitude. Oh,
Same thing. Yeah.
definitely gratitude, and just props again to Amal for really great reporting and a really thorough article that I learned a lot from reading after it was published.
Thank you both. I think your participation on this panel has been, by leaps and bounds more than I could have offered anyone. So even in the article, it's really the backbone is folks like you that are doing the work, on the ground. So I'm really, appreciative of your time.
Thanks, y'all. Hope you have a great rest of your night, week, year, all the things.